how to avoid putting DEI and belonging on the back burner during this crisis. So DEI is often seen as a forward-facing strategy. Often in many organizations, DEI either sits under marketing or has a marketing lens to it. It also has a hiring lens. So as hiring freezes increase over the next few weeks, as the economy kind of balances itself out and shows where it's headed, as well as marketing budgets and HR budgets start getting tightened and lines must be cut, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging like kind of hang in the balance. So it definitely is important to continue to focus on them. And so I'm going to share some ways in which to do that, some questions to ask yourself, and some things you're probably already doing where DEI and belonging should be tied into. I do have the live feed on my phone, so I'll try as best as possible to follow along and answer your questions, but definitely please comment them below throughout the presentation. So basically I wanted to start by answering questions. So why is DEI important during this time? Obviously we know, if you've watched the news, that different groups are affected by this crisis differently. So there is massive inequity to the way in which this crisis is affecting people. And so when you look at your own organization, I encourage all HR people to assess part-time employees, employees of lower income, employees of higher income. Right now in my organization, I have a lot of employees who are now the sole breadwinner for a time being, while their other partners either out of work or their work has diminished. So I think it really is important to do an assessment of how each of your groups in your workforces are affected by this crisis. You can also do this from a team perspective as well. Sales is probably affected by this crisis. Engineering might not be. Engineering might be used to being remote. So just recognizing that in the same way as if you have partial remote workforces, as well as, partial in-office workforces, those teams will be affected differently as well. So I think an assessment of and an understanding that every team and every person, whether that depends on their background, their experience, their life experience, their family dynamic, or the work that they do at your company, are all affected by this crisis differently. Two, I think that there is a lot of downtime, despite this being kind of a rush and a wild ride, and a lot of times it feels very hectic. There also is a time for reflection. And I think that this is a time that, Enrique and I were just chatting about this before I hopped on, where, we have been kind of put in a unique position to kind of force ourselves to approach the future of work faster than we had, anticipated. So, overnight, 97% of companies went remote. And I'm sure a majority of them thought they couldn't do that. And so I think it's a time to really reflect on what is important to your company. What are your policies and processes around DEI, and what are you centering? Like, what is your goal in those processes? And then how can you better impact your onboarding process, your hiring process, all these other processes? Take time to reflect on them and review them from a bias-y perspective to a overall inclusion perspective. Then preparation for work post reintegration. So I know it kind of seems crazy to already be thinking about this, but that's how my brain works. But basically, what is the future of your workforce when reintegration happens? Are there people that were furloughed that you're going to rehire? And if so, how are those conversations going to go? Are there people you're going to invite to be more flexible in their work from home process? What is that process going to look like, and how are the different groups affected by that reintegration? And is it a fair and equitable reintegration for everyone? Next, I think this is a time where we're going to find out what companies really value. So, it's one thing, DEI has been buzzword, or has been buzzwordy for some time, and every company has some sort of equality, some sort of inclusion, some sort of diversity language, either on their website or internally. But I think now is when kind of the feet are to the fire, and when budgets are on the line, and when the economy is questionable, is when you really see what does a company truly value, what is their actual mission and purpose, and what do they prioritize internally as well as externally when it comes to DEI. And I want to just stress that it is not more important right now. DEI has always been important. It will always be important. its importance should always be at the same level, but the urgency has increased. For many of these people, it's life or death when it comes to healthcare for trans people or for people of color, when it comes to racism that Asian Americans are facing currently in our country. A lot of this is serious life or death circumstances. And so the urgency for this and the need, particularly when people are less in front of one another and are communicating only online or via video format, is even more dire. So what is happening that DEI can be looped into? I'm sure any of you, whether you be business leaders, whether you be HR people, marketers, are all doing a lot right now, COVID related or otherwise. And so I think it's important to bring DEI into that conversation. So what changes are in process? What changes are you making? And how does that impact diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are your expectations for employees during this remote environment? Are you expecting them to be online between 9 and 6? Are you giving them more flexibility to log on earlier or later? Are you giving parents a break to spend time with their kids or teach their kids? Many of them are teaching their kids at home. Are any of your employees caregivers and need to take more time away from the day? So how is DEI or how are you being inclusive and equitable in your work from home expectations? Getting a sense and a strong handle of employee engagement and team morale. Definitely, I think we all do employee engagement surveys. I've done a handful over the past year, but I'm really leaning into team morale right now. And I know that team morale often comes with a cost, whether that be like a happy hour, whether that be an event, whether that be a company offsite, a QBR. All those things cost money. We're in a fortunate position now where, you can do like my team did, Zoom bingo, where they had a row of 5, and they literally had 25 people doing Zoom bingo. It was free. So, I think that team morale can really get creative during this time, and it can be even more inclusive than normal. A happy hour sometimes can't be attended by parents who have to go home to their kids. But now that people are at home, team culture events can become even more inclusive, which I think is a really special thing, particularly for remote workers that naturally aren't in your office every day. Performance. As this adjustment happens, it will affect people's mental health. It will affect people's wellness. It will affect people's, mental stability, their productivity. Yes, it will increase, but it will also ebb and flow. And so I think, you need to bring DEI into your performance expectations and really set those from an equitable perspective. And then lastly, if you do have essential workers that are on the forefront, acknowledge the fact that most essential workers in this country statistically are people of color or part of marginalized groups. So what are you doing to make sure that they have a more equitable opportunity? Sorry, you can hear my dog barking in the background, but that is what I mean exactly when I say, expectations of the remote workforce. We're going to have dogs bark. My partner is going to try to silence her. He's not as good at silencing my dog as I am. And here we are. Life goes on, and we continue working. What can I do internally for DEI today that's low to no cost? So I can already sense your frustration and or anxiety rising at the thought that this will cost money. And so I think there's 3 A's that I've put together that I think will allow people to kind of assess the internal environment that they have in their workplace and how to better DEI for the future. So the first one is escalate. That's basically listen and diagnose the problems that people of color, marginalized groups, queer individuals, parents, caregivers, etc. are facing. Second, acknowledge them. Acknowledge their experience, acknowledge that it's different than your own or different than others in the workplace, and make sure that they feel heard. And then third, audit. Audit the processes that you have in place that this person brought to your attention and find out a way to solve and or course correct through an audit. That can be large or small scale. So basically, in a way to provide better support to marginalized groups, make sure that your comms are inclusive. For example, we just had Easter this past holiday, which is a Christian holiday. We also had Passover, which is a Jewish holiday. Make sure that the communications you have around that are inclusive, that you're telling people to take time off if they need it for religious purposes. Maybe it is a paid holiday that you observe at your workplace, but just make sure that the comms around it are inclusive. Make sure everything that you're doing from a comms perspective, whether that be healthcare answering questions, whether that be, answering questions about America and you have employees in, Europe. Just be overly inclusive during this time in your communication. Be people first in your leadership. Ask yourself, what do people want? What do people need? And everything you do as an HR person or as a leader should be centered around those people and putting them first. Return to work and return to your workplace when it is safe to do so for your employees. Give your employees time off if you feel they need it. Currently, we do a mandatory break for 1 to 2. So I'm currently on a mandatory break for my company. And that's a people first led initiative because our employees were saying that they felt like they were working through lunch and they weren't having time to like go on a walk or do things like that. So we issued this mandatory break where we internally turn everything off. If you have to do something externally, you shift that hour to a different time during the day. But it's been super successful and very inclusive to allow people to kind of all have a break in the middle of the day. Flexibility, same mindset. We've set expectations that we don't necessarily want everyone to be working at 9 a.m. Like if you want to work from 7 to 11, take a 4-hour break and then return and work until 8 p.m. at night. We want you to do that. We want people to do what makes the most sense for them during this time. So offer flexibility where you can so that you can be as inclusive as possible and acknowledge people that have different life circumstances outside of the workplace and that they might need that flexibility. And then address the disparate health outcomes. So I think it's very important during this time to be open and honest about the reality on the ground. I think it's important to provide that clarity. So I think as much as you can be transparent and admit what we don't know and what we know. So much is unknown right now. I think strong leadership is acknowledging the unknown and helping answer the questions that we do know the answer to. Unconscious bias and racism obviously can rise during this time, whether that be because of working with people remotely, whether that be less face time, or whether that be obviously the rise in racism we're seeing with the Asian community in this country. I definitely have obviously heard comparisons to the AIDS crisis with the queer community, which I'm a part of, where people feel ostracized and different. So I think it's important to remember that prerequisite is not required for response. What that means is you don't have to have an example of racism in your workplace to establish the fact that racism is not accepted in your workplace. You don't have to have an example of unconscious bias that's resulted in some action or behavior or some bias that's been explicit to address biases and the fact that they will not be accepted in your workplace. So I think be proactive here versus reactive and definitely establish right now that unconscious bias needs to be addressed and that racism will not be tolerated. And that comes from candid conversations. Don't act like you live in this bubble in your corporate world that lives outside of the world all around us that no longer exists. The future of work is this fusion that we're currently experiencing. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that, and it's important to recognize that, this is the new normal and candid conversations are needed even more than they were previously. Allyship, for example, is something that can definitely be increased during this time. How can your company provide charity or provide assistance to certain communities? How can you represent your allyship and your support from a product perspective to an internal perspective as well? Who have you not heard from? Who may be less likely to speak up? And how can you include them in the conversation? And who are you centering through your policies? Who are your policies centered around? I think this is a unique time too, particularly for disabled persons or marginalized groups that require, different working conditions, that we now have a flexible, remote workforce opens up a lot of opportunities. And so I think it's important to make policies and expectations that are inclusive for all, and where they're not, address those individuals directly. Ask employees what they need to be the most productive. For example, we're providing, we've allowed people to expense up to $200 for monitors, mice, keyboards, etc., so they can work successfully from home. Obviously, not every company can do that, but to the extent that you can, allow people to get resources that they need. And that could include anything from an employee assistance program to teledoc services to remote tips on how to be the most productive, to workout classes, wellness, etc. And you can increase allyship through either your employee resource groups if you have them. If not, it's a great time to create them. During lunch and learns, for example, we do mental wellness lunch and learns at my company where we sit down and we talk about anxiety. We talk about social, anxieties, depression, imposter syndrome. Those are some past topics, but we've also done one centered around COVID and the anxieties that people face during COVID. And it's been a really great opportunity to just have an off-the-record discussion with employees about how we're feeling and what we're going through. And everyone always walks away feeling like they understand each other better. And then centering exercises, basically looking at the policies and processes that you have in place and center them to the people that you have in your workplace to make sure that you're an ally to them and that your policies support them. You can also audit processes during this time. And I think that's a very important thing to do, as I mentioned before. So your hiring process, it now can be more inclusive because I'm sure you're doing Zoom interviews. People aren't going to have to take off work. People aren't going to have to find a babysitter. People aren't going to have to, make up 1,000 excuses to get to your office and interview in person. And so I think hiring right now can be even more inclusive than it could have before because we're having to do it over technology. But I think you should look at your hiring and your onboarding processes to make sure that they're inclusive to everyone, to make sure that you're giving people the opportunity to speak up and include their voice in the conversation about their disability if they have one, about their, life and life conditions outside of work, about their questions about healthcare, etc. So if you are still hiring and onboarding during this time, make sure that you provide additional resources than you normally would. But if you're not, make sure you take this time to audit your process and how this learnings of COVID can impact those. And then lastly would be performance reviews and layoff conversations. So obviously performance reviews should always be inclusive, but I think it's important to note during this time, has productivity increased because people are at home? Has productivity decreased on certain teams? Has mental wellness seemed to decrease? Has morale decreased? Use those metrics in your performance reviews and your one-on-ones right now, today, because you want this documented for the future on what you can change and what you have learned. And then for layoff conversations, I think it's extremely important to consider who you're laying off, what background they come from, what experience they have, what resources they've had, and what resources they might not have had as a result of this crisis, what they're personally maybe going through during this crisis. I think all of that needs to be a part of the conversation. Obviously, at the end of the day, companies have to make the decision that they have to make. So I'm by no means saying that you cannot lay off people of color, you cannot lay off marginalized groups, but I am saying that it needs to be a part of that conversation and it needs to be addressed and acknowledged, and bias needs to be raised and addressed as well during that process. And so now I'll open it up to some questions. I'm going to look through because I haven't been looking through during this conversation. I apologize for that. And let's see. Can you come work for me? Absolutely. I wish I could hire more people. Unfortunately, HR, as we mostly know, is cost generating. So I was supposed to hire a recruiter this year, and that's been put on the back burner for the time being, not to use my back burner phrase too much. People first leadership is key, and I see a few people mentioning that. How work from home can negatively impact team results. So I definitely think that is also the case. I think there's a lot of conversations happening around working from home being an increase of productivity, because I think statistics have shown that over time. But it obviously, this has been a shock to all of us and a big blow to all of us. Our lives outside of work have all but ended. Our personal lives, our time with family, our time with loved ones, social events, etc. So this is a unique time in the sense that it's not your typical remote experience. And so I think you need to be able to assess, is the negative impact, if there is one, is it because of the world around us on top of our remote work, or is it the remote work itself? And I think that's hard to do right now. I think that should be a part of reintegration, basically assessing, would they be successful if they had a life outside of our workplace and we're working remotely, or is it the fact that we're working remotely? Because obviously this causes anxiety from a health perspective, from a family and loved one perspective, and just from a not being able to alleviate any of your stress through the gym, through social events, etc. So I think it's important to separate the two if you can. Many states and communities support to help differently able people work. Most companies can afford the things needed. I completely agree. I think most companies can afford this, and I think obviously your company can do what's right for the financial side of the business, whether that be like you ask people to bring in their monitors after they bought them, whether you consider that like employee property, or whether you consider that work property. So I think you can clarify and make yourself a little safe there when it comes to the overall investment. But I agree. I think ultimately the most important thing is realizing and acknowledging that our world is going to change after this. And so I think it is an investment for the future, regardless of how regardless of how you iron out the details when it comes to giving people the resources they need. I think you need to work. Some people ask about like just making sure how to have the conversations from legal / like finance perspective / CEO perspective. I definitely think obviously you need to get buy-in, but I think at the end of the day, off the record conversations are happening across channels, across enterprise companies. Every company is having to accept this new normal. Every company is having children in the background of Zoom meetings with clients, to dogs barking like myself, in a webinar. I believe Enrique was on a few weeks ago. My partner walked behind with underwear. So, we're just having to go with it. And so I think like at the end of the day, we all need to acknowledge that the authentic self to work concept is here and it's now, and it's not necessarily beautiful. It can be messy, but we're breaking barriers and we're being more productive, and we're increasing productivity by boosting morale. And the way that we're doing that is by being our authentic selves and blurring the lines between life and work.